All right, I think we have a few more folks trickling in, but we're a pretty full house, which is great to see. Thank you all for your interest in what I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about at Groundwork. And we have a really fabulous, very diverse panel to help us think about what is the vision for a progressive economic worldview and how do we make that a reality. So I'm really excited for this conversation with this really smart group of people. And for the sake of time, I'll just really briefly introduce them, but their full bios are available on the website. So first we have Angela Hanks, who is the Chief of Programs at Demos, a movement-oriented think tank that is committed to advancing a just, inclusive, and multiracial economy and democracy. We have Andrea Serrano, who is the executive director of OLE, which is a New Mexico-based grassroots member organization of working families. And finally, we have Nabil Ahmed, who leads Oxfam's economic justice agenda, engaging policymakers, advocates, and activists to tackle inequality in the US and globally. So I really look forward to hearing all of your perspectives on what feels, again, like this really fundamental question. How do we make the economy we need a reality? We're 40 years plus maybe into neoliberalism, into the reign of neoliberalism. And it's going to take a really multifaceted, intersectional approach to replace this harmful, really pervasive narrative. And at Groundwork, we summarize this economic worldview in a three-pronged approach. I like to say like the 3 Ps. We need to curb private power, we need to build accountable public power, and we need to center people who drive our economy, and especially people who have been pushed to the margins of our economy and society for too long. So to kick us off, I'd love to hear from you all examples from your very different lines of work, how you have seen this progressive economic worldview already happening and how these elements come together. And Angela, I'll start with you, because in a former life, as many of you probably know, Angela led Groundwork and helped develop this worldview, so you know this very intimately. I'll kick it off to you.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Abigail, and I'm really excited to be here today. So this panel is called Communicating a Progressive Economic Worldview. I feel like I need to say at the beginning that I am not a communications professional, but I am a person who spends a lot of time thinking about our economy, the story we tell about our economy, and I'm really excited to talk with the folks on the panel here today about how we do that. So as Abigail mentioned, I think for us at Demos, we have a pretty similar sort of orientation toward the economy, as Abigail mentioned, that those ideas around private power, public power, and belonging. For us, we describe it slightly differently, but I think it's sort of the same set of tools, which is breaking up and regulating corporate power, expanding public goods, and promoting models of co-governance, so really getting people in the driver's seat when it comes to shaping our economy overall. But I think the thing I'll start with is that the idea, just generally, that we need to be able to tell a better story about our economy is where we need to start. We are fighting back against a generation of neoliberalism. Actually, Abigail, when you were saying 40 years, I was like, well, gosh, this is like one of those things when you ask, like, were the 1990s 30 years ago or 10 years ago? and we're coming up on closer to 60 years of neoliberalism. This is something that's taken hold of our economy for quite a long time. I don't think we'll get out of it immediately, but it does require, if we're going to get out of it at all, it does require us to tell an alternative story. We can't just say these corporations are bad or these politicians are bad. Like, they are. we should call them out. But if we don't present an alternative vision, all we're doing is sort of, I think, giving people a lack of hope in humanity and faith that we can do things differently. And so it's important for us to say what our affirmative vision is going forward. So we can have an economy where we have access to broad-based public goods, where we have access to education, to childcare, to healthcare, and all of those things are things we provide to ourselves, to our communities, because we should have them because we need them. We should have an economy where people have a say in the decisions in their communities. We are not sort of subject to the whims of politicians or corporations, but we really are driving the agenda in our communities and our localities. And so that is a vision that we can sort of grasp onto and say, like, it can be better if we do this, but we have to really start with promoting that affirmative vision. And the last thing I'll say before I stop is also demonstrating the through line across all of our policies. I think, especially for a lot of the kind of DC-based organizations, we might be working on childcare, we might be working on healthcare, but these things are all deeply connected to one another and are part of a bigger economic story. So even as we are sort of the core experts in our area, how are we connecting it to the bigger picture when we're talking to our constituencies, to policymakers, to try to affect change in the world?
Thank you. Yeah, Andrea.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and one of the things that we've seen over, I would say, the last 10 years is this really fine-tuned understanding about what it means to be a quote-unquote poor state. So New Mexico has been last in child well-being, last in education, first in child hunger. We also are one of the wealthiest states in the country. And so when you talk about austerity politics and you talk about, poverty as a policy failure, look to what we've seen happen in New Mexico. So New Mexico sits on a $26 billion land grant permanent fund. That's royalties from oil and gas drilling. And so, that fund has been used for education, for, state universities and institutions. And so starting in 2010, the fight began to take 1% of that land grant permanent fund and use it to fund early education for all. And what stopped that from happening year after year was a handful of senators who were Democrats who really, they kept sort of saying, like, this is a rainy day fund, this is a rainy day fund, which the obvious response, well, it's raining right now. And it was this sort of back and forth rhetoric. And so really it was a combination of organizing families, organizing early educators. It was also really sharply understanding policy and understanding the needs of families in New Mexico. And it was an electoral strategy that helped that handful of senators find a new career that really opened the door to getting the question on the ballot. Because that's the thing, is that you can't just pass it through legislation. This is a constitutional amendment. And in 2022, it passed with 78% of the vote. That was across party lines, that was across ideology, that was rural, that was urban. There were only 4 counties in New Mexico that voted it down out of 33 counties. This was something that passed with an overwhelming majority. I think our governor retained her seat with something like 53% of the vote. So the fact that it passed with 78% of the vote speaks volumes that people understand very, very clearly that making this sort of very quick investment in, early education was going to impact our economy. And so these politics of austerity, this idea that we're going to sit on all of this money while children are languishing, and families are languishing in poverty. What isn't a mistake about that is that New Mexico is also a 63% people of color majority state. And so how are you last in everything you don't want to be last in, and sitting on wealth the way that New Mexico is sitting? And so I think it really is about organizing both, on the grassroots level, but also who are our partners in thinking through policy and thinking through advocacy, and then who are those legislative champions that are going to help us achieve these policy goals. So it really, then it's also how are we strengthening our democracy to ensure that people have access to voting, because you don't pass good policy without good policy makers, and you don't elect good policy makers unless people have the access to the vote. So I think that point that you made, Angela, that there's a through line, I think that speaks volumes to how we're passing policies that really benefit our families today.
Wonderful. And Nabil?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Abigail, and it's really wonderful to be here. I'd like to go to an example that speaks to this intersection between the US and the international, and really speaks to maybe a theme that I'd love to get at today, which is the importance of meeting human rights in our economy and not just property rights. And that's, you remember March 2020, how we all felt? You saw the news stories coming up around the world of this pandemic, the scenes from Spain, Italy, around the world, the hospitals filling up, hearing about the first cases being found here. And at Oxfam with others, we knew very, very, very early on that the vaccine would be the way out of this pandemic. We also knew what pharma would try to do. We had a long experience, for example, working on the issue of HIV/AIDS. The late 90s, early 2000s, saw around 12 million people die as a result of this artificial scarcity created by pharma monopolies, really, at the time. It took this big movement of Nelson Mandela and so many others behind it to take that on. So we got into the fight for something called a people's vaccine, right? A global movement with a hope here in the United States as well, which was really at the core of this global movement. And to really just take on monopoly power, right? The idea that intellectual property would be monopolized to create like pharma billionaires at the expense of the rights of billions of people around the world, right? And what was a people's vaccine? It was the idea that everybody around the world should have the right to this vaccine for free, that it should be everywhere. And it was an international movement as well. And, we moved the politics on this issue, like over 100 countries from around the world came together. The Biden administration, we got to a point where the Biden administration backed the main mechanism to take on this monopoly power. And we really kind of moved the debate. We saw a massive pushback, interestingly, from Germany, from Europe on this issue. But more than that, I think, was what we learn as a collective and a global movement, that private property, that monopoly power, that private power can't meet human rights, okay? Can't meet people's economic rights and their right to health. And what you really needed there was public power and a public option in this vaccine. We saw really just the power of that. I think we don't celebrate it enough that NIH and over $100 billion of taxpayers' money around the world created this amazing life-saving cure, created mRNA. I mean, how many times have we told that story? And it was a public option that could really help the world. But what we also saw was the growth, and speaking to the how here, not just the what, how movement matters. There was I see some of the folks in this room as well. We together formed this movement of inequality activists, of trade folks, of people working on intellectual property, on health. We had like nurses in over 100 countries coming together on this moment. And that's where we got our power from ultimately. And I think there's a huge learning from that. Maybe with more time we can go into the huge learnings and the pushback. Like the biggest weapon that monopoly power exerted to push back against this movement, I believe, was a weaponization of racism. The idea that those black and brown people around the world, they can't make these safe and effective vaccines, which is a lie, which goes against all the facts, which, most of the vaccines are actually created there. But we learned a huge amount of the kind of post-neoliberal world that we could create if we centered it on meeting economic rights.
Thank you. And I feel like these examples are really fantastic. We were talking about a state level example, national examples, and international examples. So it's really nice to hear about all of the different ways that these things are possible when we're bringing these elements together, and just when we're challenging private power, when we're building accountable public power, and when we're centering the most marginalized people. But of course, to your point about pushback, we've got to talk about the opposition. We can never be too happy in the progressive movement. We've got to talk about the bad things. So, of course, there's a growing recognition that the economy is deeply unjust. I think everyone here obviously knows that, and that it's not working for working people. And in response, better and better solutions are being offered. But a system that handsomely rewards the wealthiest and mega corporations is not going down without a fight, right? So how do we tell this story of another world is possible, the beautiful tomorrow. You were talking about this a little bit, Angela, of this really exciting, positive vision of what the world could look like, while also silencing these really dominant narratives. How do we do that? How do we simultaneously kind of do that? I'm actually going to start with you, Nabil, because I feel like you've thought about this a lot and talked about this a lot. So we'll start with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So it's a great question. It goes to this question that the former US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said many decades ago, to say that we can either have extreme concentration of wealth in this country, or we can have democracy, but we can't have both, right? And I think there's a huge amount of genuine excitement about looking at the IRA, looking at chips, looking at a whole range of activity to build from the middle out and from the bottom up, and I think that's important. I think we need to pay more attention to addressing the undemocratic power that exists at the top in our economy right now, okay? And if I was just to kind of center there for a moment, billionaire wealth in the US has increased by about 86% in the last decade. Since 2020, of all new wealth created, about 37% has gone to the top 1%, and just 2% has gone to the bottom 50%. The racial wealth gap has hardly moved since 1950, okay, and especially got worse through this neoliberal era. I think we have to have a reckoning with undemocratic power at the top, because when billionaires get $1 trillion richer, they don't just get $1 trillion richer, they get $1 trillion more powerful, yeah? And I think we have to think about what are our most powerful tools at our disposal to bring back democracy to people at large, okay? And now we're talking, for example, about, and there's many here, we can talk about the power of wealth taxation, for example. Yes, sure, we need resources, fine, but let's be honest, the US government can afford anything that it wants to do, right? But really, I think wealth taxation is one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal to address undemocratic power at the top. We also have to talk about, anti-monopoly here and addressing corporate power. We have basically this industrial oligarchy really existing in our economy right now, and I think that is the way to describe it. I was not to kind of riff off the British thing too much, but John Maynard Keynes in the late 30s was advising FDR what to do about corporate power, and he said these guys basically think of themselves as tigers or as wolves, but actually you need to really treat them as domestic animals, and just to kind of paint that imagery. And it's interesting to see that conversation in itself. And I think anti-monopoly is very important here. And I think one of the most impressive and important areas of work taking place right now is from the DOJ, and especially from the FTC. Look at Chairperson Lina Khan, for example, really kind of got these monopolists quaking in their boots, right? And I think that's something we have to pay a lot of attention to. We have to advance, get behind, from the issues of non-competes to taking on mergers and acquisitions. And sometimes we think of monopolies as these massive things. And even in the late 70s, there was action taken to prevent mergers of companies just holding about 5% of market share. So this is really about bringing democracy, economic democracy. I know Demos has done some fantastic work on the idea of economic democracy. I think it's about prioritizing that to really address this immense concentration of power at the top that exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Who would like to jump in next? Kind of that vision of tomorrow and still pushing back.
Yeah, so I think the vision of tomorrow is pretty easy because I think we've, to an extent, already seen it. So first, I think everyone in this room knows this, but ultimately the economy is a series of choices. The decision makers matter, and if it's corporations, then we get bad things like a person buying a Supreme Court justice, but ultimately it's a set of decisions made by people. And so we have the counterfactual of what happens when we don't take an active role in making decisions about our economy as people, as a democratic institution. We have the last 50 years where we've seen inequality rise, gaps in race, in income and wealth by race, and we've seen our economy worse off for it as a result. Really slow growth, really deep poverty across the country, juxtaposed against really incredible wealth at the top, and a government that ultimately has largely not been accountable to the people. The thing I'll say we have on the other side is I think the beginning of the pandemic was a little bit of a preview of what we could have. Abigail didn't go through my full bio, but I love job having. And so between Demos and Groundwork, I was at the Department of Labor for the last year and a half. And my office that I ran also managed unemployment insurance. And that is a fantastic example of we have had an unemployment insurance for the last 2 generations that has been deeply underinvestigative, that is just like a rickety system put together by like a couple of pieces of tape and nothing else. And when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, we could provide unemployment insurance to millions more people who hadn't get it, often Black and brown folks who had been excluded because of the nature of the work that they were doing. We could also give people more money. Like all of a sudden there was money, and it's like, we have money, we're a rich country, we can give people money. And those things, I think, really gave lie to the notion that we can't afford things, that we can't do big things, that our government is broke. Like, all of that's bullshit. Like, it's not true. These are all decisions that policymakers are making, and we can, as Andrea said, we can have different politicians, but we can also make different choices as well. And I think the last couple of years have demonstrated that we can give people money. We can have social insurance programs that actually work and reach more people. We can feed people, we can house people, we can make vaccines, we can have healthcare. We just had all those things, and some of them went away because they were temporary. But I think we in this room need to hold on to the fact that we saw that other world for a brief moment, and we need to have it permanently. So I think there's not enough we can talk about the response to this recession. I know in that room they're talking about the response to the last recession. We're in a different place today because we made different choices, and we have the ability to make those choices. And so I'm really excited about that, obviously. But I think and I know we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and IJA and the others later, but we have to keep our foot on the gas. We have a good roadmap for where to go because we've already seen it a little bit. We have some new things in the works, but I think there's not enough that we can press on that.
Fabulous. And Andrea, do you want to weigh in on that?
So the organization where I'm at, OLE, we're a member-based organization. And I think that we often forget to ask the folks who are most affected about these things. And part of it is that, this room, which I'm very happy to be in, isn't the room that is happening enough in our communities, at our community centers, within our organizations, within our churches, but meetings are happening. And so how often are our folks at the center of this conversation? And, how often are we making an assumption that, that folks, don't care, or that they're apathetic, or they're just trying to survive? They're trying to survive because of these policy failures. That's why folks are barely getting by, because of policy failures. They know all too well about the policy failures, our communities, and they are the first ones to bear the brunt. And so this debt ceiling bill that got passed, for whatever reason that negotiation was made, and whoever, was at the table in that negotiation, the ones who are going to bear the brunt first are poor folks and Black and brown folks in this country. And they're going to feel it first before anybody else. And so I think, when I think about what's beyond neoliberalism, or what is possible, I think that there's a lot possible, and I think those answers are there. They're from the minds that are in this room. They're also from our communities. And so when we're telling this story, it isn't just about telling this story, but it's also asking those questions of our community. The other piece, and I think when we look at opposition and how good they are at creating this villain out of anything. So, when snap cuts are made, it's going to be really easy for opposition folks to be like, well, immigrant communities, that means we have to put more bans on transgender folks, more bans on, drag queen story hour. And they're really good at just sort of creating a frenzy. And we get caught up we get caught up in the response to it, we're feeling like we have to make this a massive response. I get caught up all the time in it instead of just saying, shut up, and telling the truth. Like that's part of it is, we give so much air because what they're doing is so egregious, and they know it's egregious. They don't care how many times we're able to point at them and point out their hypocrisy. They don't care. They're like, yep, that's exactly what I'm doing. And so I think that we have to, there comes a point where we stop giving them so much air, and we start giving air to our communities, because we're not giving air to our communities in the same way that we're constantly sort of reacting to the other side. And not only are they not reacting to us, they're using our reaction against us. They're like, see how the woke people are? Like they like do all these things, and it's pretty incredible how quickly they can pivot into finding like the next group to marginalize, the next group to blame, and so there has to come a point where we have to stop making them more important than who they are, because there are more of us than there are of them, and we seem to forget to wield that power.
Amazing. I just want to ask a quick follow-up question related to that, and I'll start with you, Andrea, but anyone is welcome to jump in, which is, how do you then balance the offense and the defense? Like, should we be out there really, like, it kind of sounds like that's what you're saying, like, we should maybe a little less defense, a little more offense, shut up, and here's what we actually want to say. I know it's not that simple, but I don't know if you want to comment on that and sort of how we balance those two things a little bit.
Yeah, I don't mean to make it sound simple, and I absolutely don't mean we shouldn't be watching what the other side is doing. We should always be watching them, but I don't know that the reaction is constantly needed. So one of the things in one of the presidential debates in 2020, there was that moment when Joe Biden said to the other guy, will you just shut up already? And everyone cheered. Everyone was like, thank you. Because that was it. It was like, shut up. And so that's what I mean when I say that. But it isn't about not keeping an eye. It's just, I just think we get so caught up in the reaction, and we get so caught up in that defensiveness when really we can be playing offense. And we really need to be thinking about, once we win a policy, what's the next policy? And what's the next policy after that? And how are they building on one another and not treating our wins as one-offs? Like, sometimes I feel like we're a little bit more surprised by our wins than anybody else. We're like, wow, all right. And really, again, it's about wielding that power and really thinking through the power that our communities have. And so when the pandemic first hit, if I can, so we organize early educators in New Mexico, and early educators who are mostly women, who are mostly immigrants, and they were watching, these conversations happen about essential workers, and they were saying, wait a minute, we're essential workers. They couldn't teach remotely because they were working in early ed centers and in daycare centers, and they were caring for the children of other essential workers. And so they didn't have that moment of being able to stop. And so they actually pushed for hazard pay, and they were able to get it for a short time. They were able to get, I think, like a short amount of time. And they did all of this negotiation with our Secretary of Early Ed through translation. We had translation services. I think it was a Zoom meeting, and really fought for this. And part of it was because they were organized, because community organizing is absolutely necessary in these moments. But it also was this moment where they said, well, no, we are worth something. We are definitely worth more than what we're getting. Early educators across the country are paid poverty wages. They're not treated as professional educators. So then that actually opened the door to really thinking through, okay, we got this hazard pay for 3 months. How can we make this permanent? How do we create a wage and career lattice? And so this moment of crisis actually opened the door to a bigger organizing moment and really starting to wield power. So it was, yes, starting with their own personal narrative and then thinking beyond that. And I think that's that power of telling that story.
Either one of you want to weigh in on that offense-defense balance?
I I think you can do both at the same time. A couple of months ago, everyone saw Silicon Valley Bank and then followed by First Republic failed. And it was sort of this interesting moment because they failed and kind of immediately, the right came out with this, well, they were a woke bank. They had a black person who worked there, and so that's why they failed, was their basic argument, which was like, it's a take. And I think just a few things about that. One, I think something that we haven't talked about is like there is a growing post-neoliberal right. There was sort of the past where the right wing would never criticize a corporation publicly, let alone a bank. Oh my God, they're best friends. Like that would never happen. But now they have this woke cudgel that they're using. So if their friends fail, they can blame it on black people or whatever, and they can move on with their lives. I think that's a real threat to us because we have to be, again, like sort of on the affirmative of like, what does post-neoliberalism look like? It doesn't look like right-wing fascism. It looks like something better that black and brown folks are included in. But the thing that it also sort of raised for me was that we need an alternative vision to be able to counteract. I was a little bit bracing myself for some like establishment and or moderate folks on the other side to come out with like, I love my woke bank branding. And I was like, oh, no, like, wait, no, banks are still bad. And so, I think there was a good opening for us at Demos to start to talk about our work on public banking. Private banks are failing us for a lot of reasons. Folks were talking about the deregulation that the Trump administration did that made those banks weaker and made them more prone to fail. But it was also important for us in that moment to talk about, like, we actually don't have to rely on private corporations for banking. That's something that we can do. It's something we have experience doing in this country and in others. And so that gave us an opportunity to talk about something that I truly never thought would be in the news cycle. But it's an affirmative vision. So I think we have those ideas sort of across the board. And so using those moments where there's a crisis moment and like we don't want to talk about our woke banks, we want to talk about an affirmative vision for the economy, taking those opportunities as they come.
I love that. Nabila, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll just build on what Angela's got there as well, because, and I don't think there's any such thing as a woke monopoly, by the way. I think we can, can clearly say that. So I think, bridging on from what Angela mentioned, I think as important as a fight over policy is a fight over imagination and the very vision of our economy, right? And I think that's something I think we're all learning that we need to like prioritize much more, because I think this kind of 40, 50, 60-year era of neoliberalism, maybe 75, because I think they met in the late 40s, right? So this era of a widening of extreme inequality has coincided with a narrowing of our economic imagination, right? And how has it done so? It's done so in many ways. If I was to pick three, the first is that it's this neoliberal idea of being so ahistorical that like nothing came before, that people are poor because of some natural reason, not because of slavery or colonialism or violent patriarchy or all of the list of things we could say there. So it's ahistorical. It's also apolitical, right? So it's just inevitable. It's just technocratic. It's just, and it just narrows this kind of economic space. But I think the most powerful way that it's narrowed our economic imagination is, for me, like completely reframing the idea of human rights, okay? And to the extent that human rights has become purely about the important civic and political rights, but has cancelled, erased the idea of economic and social rights. And I feel just to go there for a sec, because I think one of the most powerful ideas of the 20th century, from FDR, on his second Bill of Rights, picked up by MLK in his call for economic rights. Eleanor Roosevelt chairs the creation of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that the right to a decent living wage paid unionized job, the guarantee to an income, the guarantee to housing, to healthcare. I think some of the most powerful ideas that we bring together under this banner of an economic Bill of Rights, and they've done away with that. And I think we need to resurrect that for the 21st century. I think some of the policy fights that we have happen in absence of a North Star for our economy. And I think we need to think about bringing back a North Star that's applicable to our era. And it's got multiple prongs. One of the contests there is just this very idea of freedom, and we've seen the language coming back on this. You look at William Randolph's push on a freedom budget, for example, in the 60s. It's like centered in there is a living wage, a guaranteed income, and a guarantee to a job. If you wanted, maybe not now in the panel because we're talking, if you wanted to do a Google later, who's talking about a freedom budget right now? It's Florida, it's DeSantis, So I think and it's a very different kind of freedom budget. So I think we need to kind of win back a North Star for our economy, win back this idea of freedom, the idea that your individual freedom depends on your economic security and your independence. Then we can really start to talk about elevated goals for our economy. And I think we really kind of need to invest hard in that narrative space.
I love that, thank you. And I really appreciate this kind of summary of apolitical, ahistorical, and really getting rid of this central notion of economic and social human rights. We talked about this a little bit in the conversation, but I want to drill down on it, which is we face a lot of opposition, certainly from the right, but we also face opposition from the Democratic establishment, from our more moderate allies, right? And yet we know that things like large-scale investment are super popular. We know that they actually make a difference in people's lives and they grow the economy. So why do you think there is still so much resistance from people who we generally consider our friends or allies? Like, why is that still happening? Why are we still facing that? Who would like to start on that tricky question? Angela made a little bit of a grimacing face, so I'd love to hear from you.
I don't know. I mean, the why, I'm like befuddled. I mean, I have no idea. But I will say this. I think in a not too long ago period, it sort of seemed like the attitude of sort of the median Democrat was like, let's pass a policy, but hopefully no one notices we did it. Like, let's not make it too big because we don't want it to change anyone's life or anything. And again, I'll go back to the experience of the last couple of years. We got to a point, of course, because of the pandemic where that just was not possible. The whole goal during that period was to have a material impact on people's lives. And that really has to be, I think, maybe it's not the North Star, but a star on the way to the North one, maybe. That should be sort of the goal of policymaking, is we should try to be improving people's lives all the time in a way that they can feel, that they can see, that makes them happier, healthier, safer, more secure. And I think that has been just like, again, I can't pathologize why, but that has not been where I think sort of the more establishment moderates have been for the last, I don't know, maybe ever, but I think that the way that we can sort of counteract that is by presenting this contrast. We do want to make an impact on people's material conditions. We want people to get childcare and know what it feels like to not have to spend down their bank account at the end of every week in order to be able to pay for their kid to go somewhere so they can go to work. We want people to not get a $30,000 bill in the mail for a procedure that they had that could save their lives, and it's one of 10 that they'll have to have that all cost $30,000. Those are pretty easy choices. And like you said, it's popular. Like, that's the reason why I can't really pathologize it, is because like you win when people are happy with their lives based on what you did. And I think the more that we can continue to hammer that home as well, that it's a winning strategy, that people like it when they can send their kids to school and they can like learn that a Black person existed. They like it when they can go to the doctor and not get a bill that costs as much as their monthly rent. Those are things that make people happier and better off. And bonus, it makes our economy stronger, more resilient too. So I think part of that has also been some fear around making the case on economic grounds. And again, we have the last 50 years of conservatives deregulating, cutting taxes, allowing the wealthy to cheat on their taxes, hobbling government to the point that it's really hard for it to be effective. We know what that looks like, and people are worse off because of it. So we can fight on the economic grounds because we're right, and we shouldn't be afraid of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Andrea?
I think there's reward from being moderate. And I think this idea of it's a scarcity mentality, and if we just, pull little bits, if we just make little tiny changes, then, we won't upset folks, and we'll make some change, and, and there's reward in it for when you take a much more moderate stance. And the reward comes from power, so it's your proximity to power. And if you're trying to get more and more, and it's individual, right? It's individual proximity to power, it isn't community power. And so I've seen it play out time and time again, and have been advised time and time again to do things very quietly, and to do things sort of under the radar, and that isn't a winning strategy for policy that impacts people's lives. I think we have to really think through, if we're trying to pass a policy, is it to gain favor? Is it to get someone reelected? Or is it to impact folks' lives? Or, are we trying to catch someone on a veto? So we're going to try to run this bill knowing it's going to get killed. All of those kinds of things, those are political choices that we're making. Political choices and policy don't necessarily go hand in hand. If you want to pass good policy, it's sort of like politics be damned, and try getting someone who's trying to get reelected on board with that. So it's also the organizing that has to go around it. The organizing, and I will say this with every answer. Every answer is going to be organizing, just spoiler alert. But really, it's the more that policymakers are coming from community, the more that they are feeling supported by community. We have this thing where we get folks elected, and then we're like, let's plan the first accountability action against them. We have to stop doing that. If we want to elect folks from community who are going to pass our policies, how are we becoming thought partners with them? How are we becoming available? How are we, using the research that's available and giving that to them for their hearings? So we have to think those pieces through when we're talking about policy, but this sort of like, let's pass policy quietly so this legislator will like me and answer when I call, that isn't helping, that is doing nothing for us but bolstering individual careers. And if that's what folks need to do, that's what they need to do, but you will be moved aside along with everybody else as we're trying to pass this really big policy. And I'm not saying this in like a posture or being big or whatever. I'm saying that when you go for it with policy and you swing for the fences, you might not pass it the first time. It took us 12 years to get this constitutional amendment passed. It took us 6 years to get the Voting Rights Act passed. It took us 6 years to get paid sick leave passed. It takes years, but playing it safe, playing it moderate, hoping that you don't piss off a legislator is not how you're going to win, from my experience.
Amazing. Yeah, Nabil.
I've got very little to add. I completely agree with everything that's been said. If there's one addition, is to say that I think we need to kind of celebrate and really showcase the good things that government achieves much more than we do. There's almost like progressivity to policy making and neoliberalism to communications almost, right? And it's and I think we've seen, and Groundwork has done a fantastic job, and many others around the child tax credit, for example, and how we communicate around that. And we can go, I think we have to kind of sometimes sidestep these elephant traps of small government or big government and so forth, and you kind of end up being in a prevailing narrative there. But I think we talk about dynamic government or government as a value creator, for example, be it some of the technologies, none of our iPhones or whatever else we use would not be here if it wasn't for some of the technologies developed as a result of NASA, to vaccines, to the fact that in the last decade, not a single pharmaceutical drug was created without government funding. Like, we need to talk about this much more. And there's that's hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, by the way. That's our role in creating that. So I think we need to celebrate, showcase, and also just reframe the idea of government constantly as a value creator.
Okay, I think I've finished processing my pathologizing. And of course, the thing I should have said is, corporations play a big role here too. Corporations spent millions and millions and millions of dollars lobbying against Build Back Better. that was actually, we did a report with People's Action where we sort of documented all of the corporate lobbying that went to hobbling the president's agenda to provide things like childcare, education, healthcare, et cetera. So it's not just like, oh, people don't like it. It's also that, their benefactors are saying, please don't do this, and so they won't. So, I think this goes to what Nabil was saying earlier. All of the folks in this room are economic experts, but this is really a crisis of our democracy too, when corporations, when wealthy individual people, singular people, can buy policy and can buy politicians, that sort of spells disaster for the rest of us. So there's some sort of like stuff we need to do to fix our democracy if we're also going to have an economy where we all benefit.
Amazing. Before we go to Q&A, so start thinking about your questions, can I have a little bit of a lightning round, if this can be done in a lightning round, which is, at this critical juncture, we've talked about this a lot. This has sort of been a theme that's been coming up in conversations throughout this conference. About how we're at this critical juncture. We've built a lot of momentum. You all have talked about it in your work. In a lightning round, to give people a moment to think about their questions, how do we build on this momentum? Like, what's maybe like the one thing we've like really got to do? You look ready, Angela. Yes.
I'm going to give a quick 3.
Yes. Oh, great. Love that.
So the folks upstairs talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act. Implementation, I think, is really everything on this. It's to the agencies, state and local governments, community organizations at this point to ensure that this investment leads to good jobs and equity, and that is something that I think is like something we cannot take our eyes off the ball on going forward. And also, I think using this as a moment to continue to articulate this different vision of how the economy could look if government can invest the way that we know it needs to in the places it needs to. The second thing I'll say is I think the best way to think about these investments is both as historic generational and also a good start. We didn't get a lot of things that we need in this legislation, including care. It's hard to believe we kind of walked out of this moment after the pandemic without having a real care infrastructure that we can be proud of. So that feels like a next thing. But this is sort of these things are the evidence for that next phase. So I think the kind of, and then maybe the last thing I'll say is the continued pushing to make sure that this is a first step, that this is the beginning, is really critical.
Amazing. Very fast with those 3. All right, Andrea?
We need to look to what states are doing. I think that it's really vital that we understand that because we have such gridlock in Congress, oftentimes states are left to their own devices for better or for worse. And so I think it's really looking at what is happening in states and how are we building networks? How are we learning from one another? Work that we've done in New Mexico was inspired by work that was done in New York. Work that's happening in California around childcare is inspired by work that was happening in DC, at the community level. So it's really looking to what's happening at the states, because sometimes it does feel like this taking a national lens can be overwhelming for folks when it feels like nothing is moving when you have an obstructionist party. And I think it's also really looking at and admitting to ourselves that what fascism is, and it is happening, it's taken hold. And so I think we need to really stop deluding ourselves that we can, I find that we always have to go to this idea of a bipartisan solution, and really it isn't about party, it's about ideology. And there has to be a majority of ideology that's fighting against fascism if we really want to see any kind of future that isn't this far right strategy.
Thank you. Number one, anchor ourselves in a bold vision, thinking about what economic rights can mean for this era. And let me add to that as well to say that it needs to be in the way that neoliberalism was implicitly racist, I believe. I think we need an anti-racist, anti-sexist vision for what comes next. And I think we have to be really, really upfront about that, because it's not going to happen unless we're not. And that's the second thing, is to get behind some big, bold, democratizing ideas for our economy and policy. We talked about some of them, like taking on monopoly power, like taking a wealth tax, like shoring up workers' rights on these individual battles that are taking place on the country right now. These are big moments at the start of the domino chain, right? And I think there we have to pay a huge amount of attention. The third thing I would say, and I'll cap off with this, is it's interesting as somebody who is originally from abroad and who lives in the States, to think about the international dimension. And I think we have to remember that progressive politics doesn't stop at our borders, right? And you can't really have a progressive vision unless it's internationalist. And that's for reasons of like, you know, morals and being just about all of this thing and about caring about people across the world. But it's also about effectiveness. It's about, you know, for example, the wealth at the top of the economy, about $4 trillion is held offshore. Half of that's in tax havens. That's Americans, okay? So you're not going to be able to get at the wealth concentration issue unless we're looking abroad. You look at global corporations. You look at, you know, what the US's role in bodies like the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, like, despite some positive signals, kind of still using the old playbook there. So I think we have to really kind of bring an internationalism to our approach if we're going to succeed.
Amazing. Yeah, that kind of sense of solidarity across.
Solidarity is the word.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Audrey Stina, and I'm part of the Open Markets Institute. So we look at antitrust and I'm doing industrial policy on that team. So Nabil, you've doomed yourself a few times over. So we've heard multiple times that it really benefits everyone if we try to communicate a lot of our ideas to people as it impacts their life directly. When you have issues like antitrust, industrial policy, trade, and international, like those are 3 steps removed from most people's lives. It's mostly about these issues of, you know, structuring markets and thinking about how these industries work together. So how do you make those connections and get people maybe not interested in the WTO, because that's, again, 10 steps removed, but communicating that these issues that seem really big against these very powerful players that are very distant do have direct impacts, and that changing them is meaningful to our lives.
Yeah, and maybe we'll take one more question, and then you all can think about how you'd like to respond.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Entralgo. I'm with the Institute for Policy Studies. I really appreciate Nabil's point about communicating not only the importance of, you know, building from the middle out and, you know, sort of leveling and building from the bottom up, but also about leveling from the top down and talking about the real mass concentrations of wealth that exist. Because I feel like when we don't name the opposition, that gives an opportunity for the right to sort of blame, you know, the state of our economy on immigrants, on people who they find to be sort of, you know, unsavory and racist and all that stuff. And I'm wondering, as sort of, what do you see as being the most effective message to communicate that? I think we had a real opportunity during the pandemic to talk about billionaire pandemic wealth, and I think that was really, you know, really a catalyst for a lot of people. But what are other ways that we can sort of talk about top levels of inequality that are really mobilizing to people? Because I think, similar to what, you know, Audrey mentioned, I think a lot of times people don't necessarily see, there's not really a name and a face to these like people who hold so much wealth. And so I think it's very not, you know, in people's everyday imaginations. And I'm wondering sort of what we can do to sort of effectively communicate that more.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks. Who would like to take that first question that is on sort of the disconnect? I mean, even both those questions kind of relate to this disconnect between impacts for real people's lives and things that can feel sort of at the 10,000-foot level.
I think you meet people where they're at and don't shy away from explaining these concepts. I think sometimes, you know, they are heady and sort of abstract because that's the language folks are choosing to describe them with. And so there's nothing wrong with starting with the person's self-interest. Again, organizing. That's an organizing conversation. You start with like, what's harming you right now? What's going on in your family? What's going on with you? And people will talk. You know, housing is a huge thing right now when we're talking about neoliberal policy and this housing crisis that we're in, and a place like Albuquerque, which forever was a really just affordable place to live, and is now not affordable. Now we're seeing apartments, you know, 1-bedroom apartments going for $2,000, which doesn't match the wages in Albuquerque. And so you start there and you start sort of building that out. One of the things that we really love to do in our electoral work is really show, why is this person receiving maxed out donations from oil and gas? What do you think that's about? Voters are really smart. People are really smart, even if they're not constantly sort of working in economic, you know, like in these really big terms. And the things that you mentioned, I was like, nope, don't know. But it isn't, but people feel the effects of it. So there might be these terms that folks aren't familiar with, but they definitely are bearing the brunt of it. If you start at where they're bearing the brunt and you start to connect it for folks, that's how you communicate that. But we can't shy away from communicating. They're afraid people won't understand it or people won't be interested. They are very interested because they're getting their asses kicked by it. It's just, it's making it palatable and really helping folks to understand this is what this is. In my experience, I think folks really understand fairness and what's fair and what isn't. And when you break it down for folks about, like, you know, there is definitely no fairness in this, there's an imbalance, I think that absolutely speaks to communities who are being affected the most.
Yeah, fabulous. Nabil, did you want to respond to that question, the second question a little bit?
Yeah, and I think the two questions actually come together really nicely. I think the first thing is to find ourselves a language that's outside of the DC bubble. We should be talking about tractors, not trade rules. We should be talking about money, not labor legislation. You know, there's many ways that we can really challenge ourselves to do that. And I think there's some really good examples of that. The second thing I would say is to really be able to show folks that this is not inevitable. Okay, so one of the things that Oxfam produces, and I can see my colleague Katie in the room, is we produce a ranking of the 50 states in the United States, plus Puerto Rico and DC, on labor, on wages, and protections and right to organize. And you can very quickly, if you're living in a state, be able to draw a comparison with another state about how different things can be across different state lines. And I think I'm using that one example to be able to show, we have to be able to show people that things can be very different, and we can do the international side as well, that Costa Rica, a country that's much poorer than the United States, delivers universal healthcare, right? And its life expectancy is far better than it is here, and you can draw many international examples. So I think there's a way of basically being able to communicate examples. The third thing, if I just mentioned this, is, and I use it as a challenge to myself, is to be able to think about the diversity that exists within our broader movement at large, right? I have a huge amount of privilege, but I also come at this as somebody who's, working class, who's, son of a bus driver and daycare worker, and I try to bring myself. I remember Shalanda speaking this morning about her grandmother, and it really resonated with me, because sometimes I'll just call back home about the work that we're doing, and they'll be like, this doesn't make sense, like, and to really and I can't tell you the number of times I have to Google the things that we're talking about in our progressive movement so I can just make sense of it myself, right? And it's okay. So I think we have to allow ourselves to be able to break from the shackles that we put ourselves in of the technocracy, and really find a way to connect with people and bring back our community organizing roots.
I'll maybe just plus one that last part in particular. I think for us, we're a national think tank, but we work with movement organizations like Andrea's. And I think the messenger really matters here. Like, if I'm like some person who lives in Virginia and I'm like going to New Mexico to be like, hey, have you heard about the Inflation Reduction Act? It makes a historic investment in our climate. Like, I don't really know that anyone's going to take that seriously, and it's not my skill set. But I think the collaboration between those national organizations and movement organizations is really important, and investment in the ground game too. I think it's not surprising to hear this, but movement organizations tend to just get fewer resources and less investment from the philanthropic community, are more subject to the whims of, like, I don't know, like in Florida right now, we filed litigation because Ron DeSantis is making it harder for organizations that are knocking on doors, helping people register to vote, to exist. And so they're sort of subject to, I think, more intense attacks than those of us at the national level. And so really thinking about sort of who's delivering that message and how we're collaborating together to be on the same page. And then the second thing I would say on the monopoly front is, sometimes these corporations give us real gifts. I heard a really great story a couple of weeks ago about the Kroger-Albertsons merger, where they were going to talk to folks in communities where they were going to see their local grocery store go away and prices were going to increase as a result of the merger. And so as those real-world examples come, whether it's grocery stores or airlines, being able to put that in real human terms for what it means for people, when you have to spend half your paycheck to get on a plane to sit in a tiny seat where they're going to charge you $12 if you want anything, but that's not water, and also they're going to charge you $40 for your seat and $200 for your bag, and charge you $1,000 to get off the plane. Like all of those things are about power, and we can use those examples that people know.
Yeah, no, and we'll take one more question, but I just wanted to kind of summarize some of that, which is that like importance of accessibility in our language. And I feel like, again, we've kind of heard that a lot, like, what's the point if people can't understand what we're saying? I think that's so crucial. And to that point a little bit, people are smart. Like you talk to people about what's going to happen when there's, the merging of these. People get it, Yeah, you might talk about monopolies and competition. These might sound like fancy words, but people understand those realities in their lives. Let's take one more question really quickly before we close.
Hi, I'm Alana Bowie with the Machinists Union, and it was a little depressing to me that no one up there really talked about organized labor at all, because I think, or a little bit, there was, it was mentioned in brief, but, I think everything from the start of these things from 50 years ago, I think that can be directly tied to the reduction in organized labor in this country, all the way up to today, whether it's getting down to the grassroots and talking to actual people on the ground, or the response to corporations lobbying on the Hill, right? That we used to have much more clout there than we do now. We certainly don't have the money, but we have the people behind us at least, right? That we have that access. And so I was just wondering if you saw, we're in decline, we're struggling, right? But we still exist, and I think that it's been a fundamental effort from the federal, state, local level for right to work and all of that, because the opposite side knows the power we could have and we once did have. And so I just wanted to know if you had any response to that.
Yeah, Angela, go ahead.
Yes, I feel really remiss that we didn't talk enough about organized labor. To me, the resurgence of organizing in the last couple of years is one of the biggest stories coming out of the pandemic. One of the best, I think, most positive stories coming out of the pandemic. And I think we're in this moment where, because of a tight labor market, because of the unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in, also because of government investment, we have this unusually tight labor market, which means that workers have more power, they have the ability to organize, they have the ability to strike, and that could go away. Like that is all sort of like by the nature of having a tight labor market, not because we've like done all of these things to secure strong federal policy that ensures that workers have durable power. And so that's like the thing that I kind of fear the most is once the unemployment rate starts to tick up, we'll see fewer places organizing, we'll see fewer folks going on strike. And that really, I think, speaks to the fact that, like, of course, we need federal policy to, we need the PRO Act, we need legislation that will actually secure the right to organize. But in the meantime, there's nothing we can do. I think one of the most exciting things for me coming out of the 2022 election was Illinois enshrining the right to organize in their state constitution. That is huge. Michigan, my home state, the state legislature and then the governor signed legislation to ensure that workers have the right to organize, rolling back some of the decades of right to work laws in a place where, like, my family, like, the reason I went to college, the reason my cousins went to college, the reason anyone in my family is doing anything they're doing is because of unions. And so, I think that is really exciting. I would have hope on the federal level that there's more that can be done on that front in the near term, but in the absence of that, I've just been really excited to see how states are really thinking about the critical role that unions play in our economy and in our country.
It's about to get very loud because I hear the other breakout is released, so we'll go very quickly.
I'll land the plane really quickly. Thank you for bringing that up. So I have my mom's union tattooed on me, UFCW 1564 local. And so I think that labor has been with us in so many of these fights in New Mexico. And there's also that understanding that people who are falling outside of what labor can do and who they can organize, we've also been organizing, but I think one of the pieces is, when we see how labor has been under attack, and right now there's a Supreme Court decision that can even further weaken unions, I think we need to, that's also the cautionary tale that all of us need to be paying attention to. And so I do believe that organized labor is one of the keys to really pushing through neoliberalism. And I think that labor itself has struggled and grappled with, the political piece and working in politics and the bold moves that they could make. And so just to see also that resurgence as well, and the fact that labor should also, be at that conversation. So I thank you for giving us that reminder, because it's vital.
Sure, I also feel remiss that we didn't go there, and I feel if we could redo this, I would have started with that. So, no, but thank you also for, and it has to be raised as well, because it's as important as any solution that we have. And it's also interesting to see right now that you see some corporations are happy to jump up the wages that they're offering to their employees, but scared, and what they will not move an inch on is unionizing, right? And why is that? It goes to the conversation that we have today, because it's ceding power to workers, to working families, and that really goes to this heart of this post-neoliberal vision. It's just, is there a more powerful way to build solidarity in our society as an antidote to the individualism of neoliberalism than unionizing? I'm not sure there is.
Should we call our new vision solidarityism? Is that the good word? No. Okay, I'm going to wrap us up.
We definitely can't call it post-neoliberalism. We need a different word than that, right?
Indeed. Yes. Send me your ideas.
Working on the solidarity economics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to wrap us up really quickly, though, thank you so much to our panel. And I just want to say, to also kind of speak to the point about labor unions, I feel like it is the perfect example of what this progressive economic worldview can be, which is challenging private power, curbing private power, really, building public power, and centering people who are most marginalized. And the labor movement is one of the best examples of that. So that's kind of a perfect way to close. Before we go to lunch, which is downstairs, can we just have a big round of applause for our fabulous panel? Thank you guys so much. Lunch is downstairs, and thank you all for your attention and great questions.